1.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our third series of our Budget 101 workshops. As you know, I'm Valerie Henning-Piedmont, Superintendent of Hastings.
And I'm Maureen Caraballo, business official.
We have really enjoyed the time spent trying to provide some information, background information that's helpful to our community with regards to how school budgets or how this school district budgets for each year, and what are the components that actually go into that. So this session will continue with a focus on expenditures and budgeting in a tax cap world. That in this tax cap world we've been in for about 8 to 10 years, that we've had to conform to requirements set forth by New York State. And we continue to, and we'll be talking about the ways in which we are dedicated to making sure that we fall within, all of our decisions are within the tax cap. In terms of our overview for tonight, we'll talk about budget goals and the budget summary, along with some major factors that impact the budget, some of which we have shared in the previous two Budget 101 workshops. And we'll talk about the impact of the tax cap, and then how that is a funding challenge for us, because that's what we can levy, that's what we can raise from our community to fund all the programs and all of the opportunities that occur within each school year. So it is they absolutely are where we kind of deploy our greatest creativity, if you can call it that, to make sure that we monitor that. Before we jump in, you probably have seen or heard a lot about the governor's State of the State address, where he's talked about some of his priorities around education and what's being funded. And I think that's really relevant for us to reference some of those, because they do have implications for school districts like Hastings. Some of the highlights from his State of the State address include, and these are the ways in which he's supporting public education. There's a focus on expanding pre-K and after-school programs, so any funds that are available will go towards that effort. Enhancing school safety through state grant funding. Enacting new vaping regulations to protect the health of youth. Increasing funding for PTAC. PTAC is a program that supports students while they're presently in the high school to actually graduate with a 2-year associate's degree. So it's a very important early college program at the high schools, and some of those are around and are highly successful models. Improving student mental health supports with funding to train educators, as well as adding what he called net neutrality protections. And the governor goes on to talk about his continued focus on funding equity within New York State's education system. And in highlighting these, he talks about gaps in funding and resources between some of the wealthy school districts in the state, as well as some of the needy school districts. And I quote, he says, he wants to use state funds to raise those at the bottom, fund poorer schools, and close the education gap. So I share that to just punctuate, again, under the title of funding challenge, what that means for districts like Hastings that don't have the same need as other districts across New York State, including one that's very close to us, which would be both New York City and Yonkers. So those are the realities, and what that means for our district is that we should expect very few additional funds coming from state aid because of these priorities that are outlined by the governor. And as I said, that's significant for us, because when we talk about state aid, this is the sort of playground or the playing field that we have to look at that indicates with a great deal of reality that we should not expect the state to help us to close any gaps that we have. So we've kind of talked about these things, and Maureen and I will toggle through these, our tag team. These are some of the values or core values of our school district in Hastings, and goals that we, that the community believes in and invests in, and becomes a a staple as part of the lineup of priorities for the school district every time we consider budgeting. This notion of maintaining our core programs and resources is so important. We don't want to lose any of the courses and opportunities that are available for our children. And later on, Maureen has added a slide that actually shows, where we rank, across some certain districts with regards to where we put our resources. So this is going to matter in terms of, looking at where our ranking is with regards to where we spend the resources in the district. Creating opportunities for all students to access higher level and rigorous courses. It's not only a priority for our school district, but it certainly is a priority outlined in ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which talks about not only equity and access, but also this notion of growth and students having the opportunities to be exposed to rigorous courses and therefore be able to enter or take early college courses while they're still in high school. And invest in professional learning for all professionals, so everyone, not just certificated employees such as teachers and administrators, but teacher assistants, teacher aides, all custodians, everyone who's employed in the district, as we are expected to maintain some of our core programs and be able to reuse and allocate resources differently. It requires sometimes that we have to receive different additional training to do so. So that's a priority. And obviously maintaining our facilities is a huge priority. It's a huge investment. The physical plant, all the buildings and the places and the spaces that our students spend their time. We absolutely want those to honor the students, so we want them to be in comfortable settings, where they, the ceiling tiles are all, well managed and positioned, and the walls and paintings and floors and chairs and tables and so forth. All those things are in good shape for our children and our staff. So that's very, very important. And then staying within the budget cap, which is mandated, the state mandated tax cap, which is a reality, and it's what we can levy, and it's certainly as has been referenced, a very significant challenge for us.
So another component that that affects how we come with our budget process is community expectations, and some of these are things that have been outlined or have been we have received feedback over the years in terms of these kind of keeping these in mind as we develop our budget. Class size, which not only the PTSA but many community members have expressed the desire to keep class sizes at a certain rate, academic programs, and that kind of really runs the gamut in terms of AP courses, a host of different types of electives people like to see, and trying to ensure that we have a variety to choose from. Our programs, and this really speaks to arts and music. We had a discussion around some of this last year in terms of expectation for both of these programs and what level in which some of the community members would like to see this being staffed and funded at. Athletics, just speaking to not only the what we do in terms of the teams we have at the varsity level, but our modified program, the policies around it, and how that drives expenditures in terms of what people like to see, whether it be just the variety of sports offerings here. Electives, again, speaking to things that are either at the high school, but also speaking to co-curricular electives, theater offerings, a host of clubs and different activities kids can participate in. Our alternative program that is housed here at the high school, and the pride the community takes in having this program here and the expenses related around running that. And then again, the security and safety, which we know is of utmost concern to many people in the community.
Mm-hmm. And again, these are some of the major sort of challenge points in any school district budget, and certainly one that impacts our expenses. And we have contractual obligations, and we've spoken about this. And every employee in a school district, regardless of that school district, does have a contract, and contracts, are, historical expectations and commitments that districts have made to different employees, and we're bound and obligated to maintain those, and certainly those are some of the things, if the district wanted to trade out some of those things, certainly they would have to, pay for those. So it's not, as though we can ask a bargaining unit, could you give us this, so that we can lower cost. They're going to say, what are you going to give us? So that's how that structure is negotiated.
And we're gonna speak to like what that looks like for us individually, but just also we'll speak to at the end where we are in terms of at the county level, just to also understand that it's not so much it's looking at what our contracts do provide and is it in fact within
reason and range of other school districts.
So we'll kind of
pretty similar. In terms of programs, Maureen, just spoke to this. Is we want to make sure that we have courses. Whether it's different kinds of advanced placement courses. I was just having a conversation, Melissa and I, with Lou and Pietro and Melissa Hardesty about Project Lead the Way, which is a STEM curriculum. That's a K-12 curriculum that's very rigorous and exciting. And if we wanted to add that, that would be an expense. Or if we wanted additional AP courses, if we thought that we didn't have enough for computer science or other kinds of disciplines that are available, to get those would require, obviously, an expense to train teachers, as well as to make sure that we have the appropriate materials and resources to teach the course so that children can take the exam at the end of that experience, which then equates to potential credit that can travel with them into their freshman year in college. Pension costs are a moving target in terms of contributing to our expenses. We, as you know, have two pension systems, the employee retirement system for non-certificated employees, and then the teacher's retirement system, which includes teachers and administrators, and I believe, I don't know if teacher assistants is under that. Yeah. So those classes of different professionals, also are contributing, have contributed to their pension costs. So it's not to say that, they have not, but districts do contribute and must. It's a state law. And they've moved it. The teachers' retirement system was certainly, it was much to our surprise and our, amazement that the state decided to allow us to, basically establish a pension, reserve, if you will. The only problem with that is you have to have something to reserve. So, if there are other kinds of things that are going on, and Maureen can speak to that, and when we do have funds to add to that reserve, we will, but it may not be that every district does have that. So we just want to mention that we are grateful that we do have that ability to kind of, reserve funds. So in the event that there's some significant swing, which does happen, that we can offset that from, year to year. Health increase, the health care or health insurance increases every year. It's much like, contracts, for employees in terms of their salaries and benefits. It's one of those benefits that does increase. And Maureen works very closely with our consortium. Most school districts are part of some kind of consortium, which does help to lower the cost or keep the cost down. But they still increase because they're dealing with the the larger carriers like Aetna and Blue Cross and Blue Shield and so forth. And so whenever those increases occur, those are passed along to the consortium and the participating members as well. State and federal mandates. I mean, there are a ton of them. Actually, the list that I shared with you earlier has a few. Improving student mental health support. I don't see that. I don't see anything that says it's being funded. So that means, and not that we don't believe that should happen, but that is an example of an unfunded mandate. Or if it is, vaping regulations, if there's something that has to be done, the expectation is that the school district does it. I don't disagree that this is an important, area to focus on. School safety, again, one of those, unfunded mandates where, all the cameras, all of the, the need for security in different places around the district. Again, I don't disagree with them. Those things are important, but there's no state funding that comes with any of those, and so that's a huge part of costs that we've seen, I think, over the last decade. And we were talking about, we were just trying to, sort of list the many different things that we've had to pay for, that districts have had to pay for, that have not come back in terms of any additional funding. So that's pretty significant and pretty huge, and we don't always know when those things are coming along, down the pipe. And then capital projects and debt. And you want to talk about that?
Yes. So just in terms of that's a significant portion of the budget that we always look at in terms of what the some of the capital needs that have to either be addressed, and again, we did issue a recent bond and how that overall expenditure fits into our entire budget. And then I just wanted to mention with this list, as you notice, some of them are internally driven, or programs and contractual obligations to a certain degree, and enrollment. But other than that, much of it, because even I would argue that some capital improvements are also there's certain things that we're mandated to do, some of which we choose to do. But many of the increases are external to us and drive us. But the capital projects and debt, again, is something we have to weigh as we're looking at our entire budget.
And Maureen referenced class size and enrollment earlier. We're always looking at that information. We're always looking at projected births. We're looking around to see if there are trends that are already impacting, let's say, our neighbors, to our north, and maybe they haven't gotten to us yet. So we're always looking at, any trend data that helps us to make some decisions about, how do we make sure that we, fulfill our commitment to the community with regards to their beliefs about, classes and the ability for those classes to be at sizes that, that allow our educators to work closely with students, to engage in some of the kinds of projects that that require them to move around the room and to to have children working together and presenting and so forth. So that's a significant sort of area that we look at from year to year.
And even for us, like enrollment, the small districts, this is more challenging for us because when new kids come into the system, it's not as easy for us just to absorb them into it. It's like just a few students, and any kind of cohort can kind of push us to another section. And also, I'm sorry, yes, Steve?
No, go on. Finish
Okay.
up.
No, I'm just saying that in that being a small district, whether it be the AP and the class sizes and selections and our schedule, a few kids in either direction can have an impact on us. Not so much on a district that's even 3,000 can absorb those students a little bit more easily than we can.
Absolutely. And we saw that this past summer when we were looking at, where were we going to reduce a section? Was it going to be kindergarten or was it going to be fourth grade? Because we were, seeing some of the numbers. And again, we were looking at some trend data, but still, families move and you're closed where you're leaving at a certain time that you think you will, but you don't. And so there are some variables that do impact, our ability to kind of know with precision, whether or not 2 or 3 students can make a big difference for some of our classes. So, it is a pretty significant, sort of moving target that we have to focus on.
With the pension reserves that you mentioned, does the district have?
Yes.
Can you say how much?
So our current balance between the ERS and TRS reserve, I think, is 1.3 million.
So that's something that you've been able to put together
Yes.
over the years.
And we do draw from it every
2
year.
years.
Last
year we started.
No, ERS
ERS,
we've had for
TRS.
like 8 years. TRS was new, and again, you're limited to the dollar amount, like in terms of so TRS, the most we could reserve last year was like $250,000 because of the they only let you reserve a certain percentage of your total liability. So we currently have $200,000 in that account. But to Valerie's point, that TRS, the Teachers Retirement System reserve, was only established last year for the first time. The other one, the Employees Retirement System, and I think part of that is because the state established that, and the state who controls it, they have their employees fall into that category, not the TRS. So we did get that last year. So it's an important thing to help the peaks and flows of the.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So the money for that comes from?
Like when we have either revenues that exceed our budget or expenditures that are less than what we had budgeted for. So at the end of our fiscal year, whatever funds are remaining that were not expended or additional revenues, that money has to be allocated to either reserves or to appropriate to the next year's budget. So we do that in June, and then once we kind of have our numbers fleshed out.
Thanks.
So the next slide that we're going to talk about is a infographic that we've used in the past, which is basically showing us the salaries and benefits.
So just on this sheet again, we're really focusing on the main driver of the budget tonight, and the main driver are the as any employer would be to pay Social Security, Medicare, pension, health care, other benefits that are negotiated in, and some of which are workers' compensation insurance is a mandate. Disability insurance, we have the ability to fund it differently, but much of this are things that are required of us.
And of all organizations, all school districts are, faced with those things that, as Maureen mentioned, that we can't control or change. I mean, there's no way to change a previously negotiated wage increase. We definitely aren't able to just take those things out of a benefit package and say, what, this year we're not going to do those things. It doesn't work that way here or in any environment. Employee retirement system, as Maureen mentioned, we must contribute. Teachers' retirement, we must contribute, and those increases occur, every year, and they're dependent upon, the success of the stock market and, and other kinds of variables that are part of that equation. Health insurance premiums are always going to increase. Again, they're on that side of the scale where we don't have any control over those. And obviously, Social Security, Medicare contributions, those are all, outside of our control, but yes, we must comply. And then previously negotiated welfare benefits, dental and visual, and all of those, that those are, there are increases every year. And that's significant, and I think, that, as Maureen pointed out, as you see the division of how a service industry like a public school setting or public schools, actually distribute the expenses across the different employee groups. So that's the point of this infographic, which we've used, and we think it's a valuable way of conveying the realities of what we read about and we talk about, but may not get into at great levels of depth when we actually have our formal board presentations at the board meetings.
Okay, so this again, we're just going to briefly go. This is just demonstrating our expense overview. It's broken down into the categories, and these are set by the state in terms of how we categorize our different expenditures. General support includes any type of central office salary. It includes our buildings and grounds and all our utility costs, our insurance, including our liability insurance that we're of course required to carry. And all those type legal expenses and things that are just an operational expense. Our instructional budget, again, is anything that falls into that instructional category that we spoke to, including athletics and other items such as that. Our transportation, again, is self-explanatory there. Undistributed is a combination, but is mostly, in our case, all the employee benefits. That's required to be reported in that way. But obviously about 13 million or 12.7 million of that is just in benefit costs, both health insurance and expenses related to the retirement system. And then the remainder there is our debt. So the undistributed are those two. So just again, just to kind of give you just in a summary form here, how our dollars are breaking out. And again, we spoke about the percentages of how that looks. And that was our current adopted budget.
And in this particular graphic, it's the story that we just shared earlier with regards to, what it actually looks like in terms of, the 81% of salaries and benefits, what portions are left, which would be equipment and contractual supplies through BOCES, which represents about 17%. And as you recall, BOCES is a very important service to us because that's a way that we can keep down costs and manage costs, because we, along with other districts that participate, are benefiting from BOCES' ability to negotiate a lower rate for us. So at the end of the year, they're required by New York State to reimburse certain expenses to districts, and that could range, from I don't know, from something as low as 10% all the way to perhaps 70%, depending on what the service is. So that's why that's so important. That is so important in terms of us mentioning that in spite of the fact that there are always contracts that we have to negotiate with them that also increase, we're also getting a better value because we are negotiating and benefiting from the reduction across other districts that are also helping us to keep costs down.
And I just want to highlight, obviously BOCES is one part of that, and just to kind of, and when we get into the budget presentations themselves, we'll really get into that, because other people say, well, what other things may fall into the contractual category? And again, just to remind people, about 1.7 million of that is in our transportation expenses. That also includes tuitions for students that would have to go out of district, or any type of OT and different things that we do contract out, which again are in fact servicing students, but that would also be included in contractual. In terms of other types of contracts, they would be, like, the majority of it is student-driven contractual expenses, our supplies and other points. And again, we're going to really get into those numbers when we present our entire budget in February, and people can kind of get a real sense of how that break out. But the majority of it is the contractual expenses are really student-driven expenses for the most part.
They are.
Except for like maybe a couple, like I said, maybe some legal and things like that, but the big dollar amounts there.
Absolutely. And some of our professional learning costs are there because, again, we use BOCES as a mechanism for making sure that we participate in the cost sharing and the cost savings primarily. And so you'll see us going towards BOCES, or you're asking the board to approve contracts through BOCES because, again, we receive that reimbursement. They're also, the best, resources to, at that time to bring in, but we're also cognizant of making sure that we pay attention to cost. With regards to salaries in particular, so as I mentioned earlier, there are things that are historical in contracts that we can't negotiate out. But what we do when employees do leave, so if there's a teacher who leaves at a certain salary, let's say that teacher has been here for 30 years, that teacher is pretty high on the salary schedule. We're not going to bring a new teacher in that's also high on the salary schedule, and that's called zero-based budgeting. So we're going to be looking at that position. We're going to be looking at, where we are, what we need, and, is there another need, with regards to another content area, or is that position shift from one building to the next because that's where, a group of students transition to. So we're always going to be looking at bringing a teacher in, at a much lower salary because, again, there's, the market is pretty sort of, saturated with certain types of teachers, and in Hastings it's a great school district, so we don't ever have any trouble recruiting, teachers, but we also are not going to be bringing someone in at the same salary that we, that a retiree left, and that's, as I said, one of the ways that we, manage some of the salaries.
And again, then each position is evaluated each year based on class size, enrollment, IEPs, and special course offerings. So now we're just going to touch upon, we've been talking about some of the contractual obligations that we have that are factoring into our overall budget, and just kind of show you by different category what some, like Valerie had mentioned, some of them are historically in there in terms of some of the step increases, although over the last few contracts we have tried to address it and try to smooth out some of those bumps, but much of it are things that are in the current contracts and that we have to address because we're required to. So again, this is just a definition of what's the effective increase. The effective increase is the actual annual salary increase, which includes both the employee's step advancement and the application of the schedule increase. And again, the schedule increases are in fact negotiated, and that's the cost of living, I guess we'll use that word. And then employees on top step only receive the salary increase. They would not be eligible for step. So in looking at the different bargaining units, and again, this is giving you kind of a range, but this is going to be tied into how, as we look at what some of these increases are and then see what our allowable growth is under the tax cap and the challenge it is in trying to, you know, pay our obligations and also manage to stay within it. So this is the teachers' contract, HTA, here in Hastings, and it gives you a sense of what the minimum step increase. So this 1.8%, which is the first column, that really reflects some change in some of the tables in which the HTA over the last few negotiations has agreed to extend some of those step increases. So it has, in fact, started to help us. I mean, believe it or not, these were higher. This is actually, this is, you know, on the lower side. There's some school districts that their lowest step is 4 and 5%. And then our max step in that contract is 4.82%. And then you'll see that our negotiated increase for the HTA was 1.75%, and this is looking again at next year. And so our range in increases for that staff, and I showed you before where that's the majority of our staff members fall under this contract, that members will either receive somewhere in the range of, if they're at the top step, and we, although we have some of our employees there, we do definitely have, some buildings we have a much newer staff, and we do have some people at top step, but right now we're not, in our contract, we have kind of people who fall in all these categories. So some people will actually effectively get a 6.57% increase next year. Others will get the 1.75, and others are somewhere, if they're on the lower end but still moving on the step, they'll get somewhere in the 3 to 4. And again, there's different variations of this, but this gives you a sense of the swing in the increases. This also only includes compensation. If an individual would be eligible for longevity, overtime, or additional stipends, that's not included in this, in the increases. This is just, I'm just talking about their base salaries here. And it also excludes lane column changes, which if a teacher is able to accumulate enough credits and move to another lane, that's not factored in here. And that for some people, that could be anywhere from a 2% increase on top of these numbers to sometimes 8 or something. So this is, you know, part of the challenge is these, some of which, like I said, existed, the step increases existed, and then the other piece are the negotiated increases, and that's where we have some control, you know, more control over.
Questions about
Yes.
For the step increase, it's for educational advancement credits.
No, so
No.
the step increase is the lane, and that really speaks to the year.
The
So
lane?
So the lane changes are when you go from, say,
Masters,
MA
Masters 30, Masters
Right.
60, those.
That's the column.
Yes.
The step increase is based upon years of service.
So it's longevity.
No, longevity is on top of that on the bottom of the schedule.
But years of service in many places is longevity, how long you've been someplace.
Correct.
So it sounds like it's redundant.
Right, so when people get
You're
to
getting
yeah.
longevity, but then it's years of service, which is also longevity. It's a little, the board game is a little puzzling to people outside the system.
It is.
It is, and it's not, it is somewhat, I mean, it is like kind of how these
This is part
exist.
of public schools everywhere, that there is, you know, at some point in time, there was a benefit to keeping people and rewarding them for
Of
being
course.
around for a while,
Yeah.
and certainly public education, which
Absolutely.
didn't have these increases many, many years ago when, you know, I was a student sitting in a class, you know, probably, you know, you were a student sitting in a class too during those years. You know, there were teachers who were making maybe $10,000 a year. So remember, this is, you know, over time, you know, this really, you know, has not been the trend. It's only, you know, in the last maybe, I don't know, 15 years, you know, that we've seen increases. And these are commensurate with other bargaining units. And you're going to see another group and another group where it depends on that group. It also depends on, you know, how long that group stays in. I mean, the maximum also represents what we want it to represent, which we want great employees to stay around for forever.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think, Steve, that's, you know, a good point, and just not everyone is accustomed to seeing this.
Longevity and longevity.
But I think as we speak to, and we're going to get, these are kind of just showing you our individual factors and the challenge that presents in creating our budget, but then we are going to speak to kind of giving you some sense of where we rank amongst other districts, and I think that just helps people understand that we also don't live in isolation, and how our labor contracts, you know, meet like our comparative to others.
Absolutely.
So much of it is, although we do, and I believe our employees do try to work, you know, with us, some of this is puts them pretty much in the range of, you know,
Their
their competitors. So again, this is the clerical and the TA contract, which is another bargaining unit in the district. And you'll see now, this one, you'll see a much larger spread, and I'll speak to some of where you'll see on a very high the max step and what that represents. So again, but this is just shows you the challenge that we have in budgeting depending on where these employees fall and what the dollar amount related in our overall increase in our budget year to year. So at the minimum step here, if they're still on step schedule, the step schedule is 11 steps. They can be receiving at the lower end 1.87 increase plus the contractual increases there are 2.5%. And then at the max, there are some people that would be eligible for an 8% step increase with a 2%. If they're on top step, again, they just get the cost of living. But just to remind people, this bargaining unit, much of some of that step increase was a result of a renegotiation of this contract in which many of the newer members make much lower salaries, and the dollar amount on this is it's a large percentage, but we were looking again, just as I was looking at the salary schedule, some of this is somebody who's either making 31,000 going to 33 or 34,000, and at those numbers like a 2 or 3,000, and this happens once they are kind of in their outside of their probationary period. Once they clear a certain amount of years, they do get, there's 1 or 2 years in which they get a little bit more of a significant bump. But the trade-off for that is we actually did change a lot in this contract, and actually, even with those step increases on some of those columns, the renegotiation of the salaries related to those schedules saved the district a tremendous amount of money. So just to kind of, you know, when you see a 10% increase, but again, it does still present challenges as we're trying to a year-over-year increase, and when we're trying to stand in the cap. Again, the custodial unit, same story. You'll see the range in the step schedule. Their step schedule, I believe, is only 8 steps. Again, we have about half of this bargaining unit, or more maybe, are at the top step. It's 18 people, and then some of the newer members are still either somewhere in between that minimum and max step schedule. And again, this was a result of a renegotiated contract that changed different kind of beginning and end salary schedules, which, although there were a couple bumps in there, still resulted in a favorable contract for the district. And then administrative, this one is much more straightforward. The administrative step schedule, they receive 2 steps a year. Each step is worth 1%. And then in addition, they receive a 2% cost of living increase on top of that. If they're on top step, they get the 2%. And again, this excludes longevity and top step stipend if a person were to be eligible. So again, it kind of shows you the range in which the salaries go up in that bargaining unit.
And we've summarized some of these, but again, it's important to punctuate, you know, that there are certain, you know, ways in which we try to offset some of those increases, which again, are negotiated, you know, are historical, are competitive and, you know, consistent with neighboring districts. You know, we can't, you know, try to negotiate a lower salary for any of these employees and expect to, you know, actually be able to hire people because, you know, our competitors, you know, not only in our neighboring Rivertown competitors, but across the region, you know, would certainly probably be more likely to hire those employees than we could if we were not offering them a competitive salaries, so that's another factor that's very important. In terms of some of the ways in which we try to, to deal with this challenge of increases in contracts, but at the same time, a set tax cap that's required under New York State is, what we mentioned earlier is this notion of bringing in any new employee at a much lower salary on the salary schedules that Maureen talked about. That we wouldn't start a teacher, a brand new teacher, at a higher salary step. If we just retired a teacher, at a who was here for 30 years or so. So that just wouldn't happen, and that's consistent with practices across the region and across the state. In terms of the tax cap and state aid increases, I mean, we don't have a lot of control over that.
Right. So, but it just in here speaking to when we do in fact have the ability, this I think this particular item speaks to. It is important to consider going always up to the max cap because the fact that, as we laid out, these salary and benefit growth are exceeding, in many years it'll exceed whatever the tax cap is, and even when it is maybe within the tax cap, and but it's important to try to leverage our tax cap when we are able to, when there's an ability to kind of, when it's at the higher amount, kind of to go up to the cap, and that's speaking to how we that help offset some of those larger increases. And if state aid, and again, Valerie spoke about using BOCES to increase our ability to get some state aid back in those categories, because that actually does drive state aid increases, which again then helps us offset some of these larger increases that we'd be facing in that. And then again, these are just at times ways that we can, things we can do to try to help offset some of those salary and benefit growth negotiations. There's always an opportunity to try to find, reasonable ways to live within the tax cap and maintain what we have, and working together with our bargaining units to help soften some of those increases, to sometimes help us when you can stretch those steps and like lower those year over years, that's helpful to us in budgeting.
It is, and there are also trade-offs when we do use some of these measures. So, let's use that last bullet, attrition, and retirees' position is not replaced. Well, the students didn't go away, so those students then have to be distributed across those teachers who are teaching that content or that grade level. And we started this presentation with a review of some of the priorities or some of the commitments that the community expects with regards to the experience that children are having in our schools. And we don't want class sizes, we don't want a kindergarten class size of 30. We don't want a 6th grade math class size of 35. And so we have to be judicious and careful with, being, sort of taking every retirement as an opportunity to reduce that position. That doesn't always work out, and that math doesn't work out so well. So just keep that in mind as well, when we're thinking about this. Where we can, we do, as Maureen mentioned earlier, we do look at, requirements, whether there's mandated requirements or if there are changes that would allow us to realize some savings, but it's not always as sort of neat and clean as we would like it to be.
Okay, so this slide here just demonstrates what our employees back to the bargaining units. Each bargaining unit has a different amount of money that's negotiated in terms of their contribution to the health care that they receive. And this graph here just kind of gives you a sense of those different ranges that exist. And on the lower end, and what we've tried to do is, as we've renegotiated contracts, sometimes the employees that have been here for a certain amount of years, and like as in the CSEA units, some of their members pay lower, but then the new members that are hired then do pay the higher contribution rate. So in the first example, the 7% is the rate that the custodians pay that were hired before a certain date, and then people who are new to the unit would, depending on the bargaining unit, would pay more. And this is just kind of shows you across the board, the teachers and the administrators all pay 16.5% contribution to their health care benefits, and then like 15% is for a two-person. So just to kind of give you a sense of what the district portion is and the employee portion of it also. But also to keep in mind that there are some bargaining units, and it does make sense that some of the lower paid staff would pay less because the insurance is the same across the board, but even under Obamacare, you're only allowed to, there is a formula for people that would be making less on the salary scale, that we can't exceed, their contribution can't exceed a certain percentage of their salary. So these are things that also contribute to our ability in terms of how much we can ask the employees to share. And I had mentioned this to Valerie earlier, now districts where people who, prior to, with the Obamacare, did require us with people who are even substitute teachers, that they work over a certain amount of hours. Now, in the past, we didn't have to provide them health insurance benefits. Now we're required to do so, and we're not really allowed to get that much, really allowed to get a certain percentage because they, in fact, don't make, in terms of their salary thresholds, we would not be able to, have them paid 15 or 20%. So, there's a lot beyond us. Again, there's things that happen, federal and state, I would say, mandates that, healthcare was one of them. The mandate to insure people. Years ago, districts had the flexibility. Those were all contractually negotiated. Some of it is now outside the contract. It's federally mandated to provide health insurance to certain employees if they work over a certain amount of hours a week, including even like people who are like coaches and substitutes and things like that. So those things also had, had an impact in terms of like our ability to, maintain our health insurance and the cost of it.
Absolutely. And there's a cost, that we contribute to just to participate, and that's the administration of the program. So, all of those costs, are absorbed by, the school district or the taxpayers. And some of the consortiums, I'm not sure if Swiss Chickens is doing this, but some of the consortiums have even adjusted some of these so that, more, so a family pays more than
that's how ours
two
is.
family.
Yeah, ours is like that.
And so
yeah.
that does also, kind of make it a little more even across the
Swiss Chick does
contributions.
that. Mm-hmm. But it's still very expensive, but comparatively, we have done RFPs for health insurance, and even with what we're paying, it's still less than the cost of some of the private other health insurance plans, significantly actually.
And we talked about this, and I think the important takeaway here is that the way that that New York State has kind of slowed the pace. I mean, educators have longevity, and in terms of once they retire, they're pretty much around for a fairly long time. That's a good thing. Like some of my retired friends, I want them to be around for a long time. And so what it's meant is that that the state has added more tiers to the system, and that's the first time in a long time that in 30 years that I think we're up to tier 6. And that simply means employees who come in under that tier are contributing longer to the teacher's retirement system, and a greater amount is being contributed. So that certainly does, help, the employer, because we still have to contribute, but the fact that that's occurring, and again, it's every employee in the system, whether they are teachers or administrators or assisting in the classrooms or custodial team, they are members of either the TRS or the ERS system.
Yeah, and I think these new tiers that were introduced by the state, I think, we're starting to see other, some of our newer employees are in fact in those lower tiers, and the contribution level, the percent we're required to contribute for those individuals helps bring, it's a blended rate, it helps drive that down. I mean, the one thing is we'll wait and see, long term, some of the changes, they had the tier 5 and the tier 6, it's going to require people to work longer. So I think there will be a point in time that we may see some change to it, but in terms of employees contributing for the life of their career toward their pension, I think was a good change that the state implemented. Requiring people to be at 62 now and have more years in the system may end up costing districts later, because then people will not be eligible to retire where you get the breakage and the savings. So, but we are starting, I think we're starting to see some of that helping, although sometimes when I show you the percentages, you may not believe it, but I think if that wasn't in fact there, we would see these rates to be much higher.
Mm-hmm. And we talked about the fluctuation, so you see that now.
So again, this is just, I think we've shown this before, and again, just because we're focusing tonight on our costs associated to employee benefits, just to see some, since 2011-12, some of the rates that the TRS, and that's our employer contribution. So this rate is applied to salaries for all people that would be in that, under that TRS umbrella, and this also includes stipends. So coaches or any type of extra work anyone does beyond their salary is also pensionable. So chaperones, anything and everything. So it's for us, it's well over $2 million, the cost of this one line item in our budget. You can see that we had, thankfully the rate was coming down, 1920, it was great, it was
13, 14, and 14, 15.
Right.
I mean, could you give us a sense of what that contribution was? So if there was a 16.25% increase in the 13-14 school year, Maureen, and again, you didn't know that until probably, you would have been notified around December maybe of that school year. What additional monies did you have to send on to Albany as a result of this increase?
That year was, it had to be $4.5 million plus, again, because the salaries were a little bit lower back then, but I would say $500,000 to $600,000, some type of budget over budgeting.
That's a large amount of money, which is why we mentioned earlier for TRS that the district's ability to create a TRS reserve is no small thing. When you have those kinds of swings, and hopefully we won't have that kind of swing again, but we don't know. It does fluctuate. So we do have to be prepared, and all of what we've been talking about is really just finding ways to be prepared to the extent possible, but that this is a moving target that we don't have any control over.
And as you see, it is slated though to go back up next year, although not back up to those 16 and 17%, but again, something that is a driver in our budget planning for this year, because that change in percentage is roughly like a $200,000 to $300,000 increase in expense for us. So just to kind of give you a number behind it. And again, I love just to put the all-time low, 200102, it was 1/3%. And I mean, just to kind of demonstrate, those were the easy days.
They're gone.
They're gone. And again, this is just a graphic of that. I don't think we need to go through it. It just shows the trends in 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. Again, state aid, I think we beat this to death last week. We went over kind of, what funds we receive and how those funds, like how, the definition behind each of those different categories. This is just really to demonstrate that, like Valerie had mentioned earlier, I think, I'm happy that we have had a little bit of an increase. Since 15-16, we have, in fact, seen a little bit more money going into the district, but I don't think there's not going to be a big amount of money we're scheduled to receive, and we're happy, we'd be happy for it to go up a bit, but just as long as it doesn't go back down, we're not going to get much relief from the state in terms of our budget.
What we've had across the years, you can actually see what was actually sent to us from the state. So 18-19 school year, you'll see the actual received in the projection. The actual was more than the projected. We like that number. We always like a little extra.
And that's where the fund balance comes from. Yeah. So when we actually,
it's a good point.
This is kind of when we were talking about, well, where do you get the extra couple $100,000? So we typically, and as do most districts, and although those numbers are coming closer together, we try to be very conservative in budgeting. Well, I would say we're conservative in budgeting our state aid projections, but then in fact when there is an increase that is either driven by expenditure driven aids, or maybe a couple extra dollars that our legislators are able to get the governor to give to us, you'll see what we have budgeted versus what we actually receive. When you have those additional funds, those are the funds that help us put money back into our reserve account. Yeah. So that's one area.
That's one area. But that year, Maureen, you probably didn't, because our TRS increase in the 18-19 school year was 10.62%. So more than likely you used the additional state aid to just send it right back to the state.
Well, that year, the budget was already set, so we already knew that expenditure, but that money did go back to a reserve fund. But again, the amount between those two numbers is becoming a little bit smaller. Mm-hmm. I mean, years prior, sometimes we would be getting a little bit more of a positive, but as you see, as we're budgeting, and even in our next year's budget, we'll be closer to that, we're getting closer to that actual amount, and that, is less dollars, but.
Sure. Yep.
Should the state not do so well, and therefore less aid available, what's the plan?
Well, I think that the one thing for us, and not that this is a good thing, so a couple years ago, when they were in the total economic downturn, they did take money away from all the districts, and it was called the gap elimination aid. It was the first time I think they instituted something like that, and that was to close the gaps in their budget, the state. And at that time, the one thing is you do get that information in advance. They don't take it from you, so that would go into the budget planning. I think the one thing for us, and even although it was not great back then, the one thing that we sort of have going for us is we don't get, in the grand scheme of things, we don't get a lot of state aid. So although even at that time, it was very difficult for us, we had to manage it, it wasn't, because we don't get that much to begin with, the amount they can take from us. Other districts were seeing like millions and millions of dollars taken from them. I think the plan is, again, that's why we try to be as conservative as possible. We've been saying all along, we know we can't rely on the state fully. So I would say yes, anything that would take away from us would provide a challenge, but we are very cognizant that we're not getting a lot of money, nor do we go into our budget planning thinking we are. So we really try to come from a place of like, we'll be lucky if we get what we've received the year before, and also needing to be thoughtful about it if in fact they did pull back any money, where in fact would we get that from. So it's part of like the whole conversation, and it is, and I guess that's why I'm always saying I'm happy to get what we're getting, because I do remember a time in which they were taking it back from us. So it's definitely something to we need to be mindful of, that the state is not going to come and give us money. So anything that we're deciding to do, we really have to think about, can we pay for it and can we sustain it?
Absolutely. And one of the other areas that, I guess it's state/federal funding. So we do receive not a significant amount of money, and it's Melissa manages these. It's the Title I fund, which is part of the War and Poverty Program, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, now called the Every School Succeeds Act. But it's monies that we received as a result of our census, the census data, last census, that indicated the numbers of families who were considered, living under the poverty threshold. So we receive funds, but they're not a tremendous amount of funds, and they are specific and designated for programs that support students, whose families are economically insecure. We also have funds under Title IIA, which is the support some of our professional learning objectives. Again, that's not a ton of money. Again, driven by information that from with regards to the census report. And we receive 611 and 619 monies, which supports students with IEPs. Right. Again, the state could reduce those, and so it's also, that's, while we can see what we're going to receive, remember what the governor said, the focus is to use state funds to raise those at the bottom and to fund poor schools and close the education gap. As I said, we don't disagree with that, but it really does, mean that districts like Hastings, could easily see, reductions in those grants throughout the school year. So, and if there are reductions in those grants, it means that we have to make a decision. Do we fund those initiatives that we had planned, or do we use the funds from our budget? In most cases, we're going to have to reduce those programs, those initiatives, because we can't afford to to use the general budget because you didn't budget for them. And so that's one of those sort of prospective challenges that we might encounter as well.
Okay, so again, we've spoken about this slide at an earlier meeting, and it just speaks to what the allowable growth factor, the CPI is. And again, this is a number that is given to us from the state yearly. A lot of people think about the tax cap as being 2%. It has ranged from being less than 1% to over 2%. This year, we received our number last week, and the number for the allowable growth for next year for all school districts in New York State will be at 1.81%. And again, as we talk about that plus our individual brick and mortar growth factor, you'll see, the challenge as we spoke about before, that these numbers, although are much below which some of our budget to budget percentage on our salaries and other expenses, that amount barely kind of covers what the growth that we're experiencing in terms of those areas. And again, this is our tax-based growth factor. This is derived from using a quantity change factor, which is calculated for us by the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, and it's based upon information they received from the town of Greenberg's assessor's office. It measures brick and mortar, new construction, or significant additions to the existing properties. It can never be less than 0. We've received ours, it's 1.39% for the 2021 school year. So you basically add the 1.81 to the 1.39 to get what your allowable tax cap number is. So this year kind of now takes what we spoke about earlier and kind of compares it to what, in speaking about what our allowable growth factor, the dollars now behind that.
Mm-hmm.
So our allowable growth factor, again, this is an estimate we're still finalizing, or our final first run of the budget. But as of right now, that amount, those two percentages would allow approximately $1.3 million of additional taxes to be levied for next year and stay in the tax cap formula. Now, it is a good amount of money, $1.3 million, but when you look at what we spoke about earlier, like what some of our expenses that we know, and that's not with an increase in staff or increase in programs, just everything we've done this year, applying their contractual step increases and their cost of living increases, and again, these others. So right away, approximately, and this is a pretty good approximation because we've run these numbers, our contractual growth for our existing staff, like just the people here without any retirements, is about $850,000. That's everyone who works here, just moving them over with the contractual obligations that exist. That is the dollar amount just to pay for those things. Our health insurance increase, again, that percentage is dictated to us by, although it wasn't terrible, better than it's been, it's like a little bit below 4%. That equates to about $300,000 or so of increase for us. And again, this is based upon just everything we know today, like the people that we have working here, and there could be changes where some people may not need the health insurance, but this is basically to keep our health insurance, pay our bill there. Pension costs increase, again, we spoke about the increase in the contribution rate, and also as people's salaries go up, that also is an increase. So it's two pieces, one of which is being driven by the percentage that we're told, and another is on our contractual increases. The more people get paid, the more you would have to pay for them, even at the same percentage. So that's around, again, we're going to finalize these numbers, but again, it's about $300K or so in that category. Increased mandate costs. Again, this just speaks in general terms. If a child needs a certain service, we have children that are coming into the system from preschool that we already are aware of, and there's some of them are going to have some required mandated costs, whether it be special education services or whatever they may be for that particular child. But again, just knowing for some students that are in district, coming into the district, we right now it looks as though about $250,000 of an increase would be needed to address those mandated costs, and then an increase in other contractual services. And this just speaks to all the contractual services we have. We have different things we're required to do next year with like water or lead water testing. It's like $28,000. We have to pay for that next year. It's not every year, but we are in fact have to do our water testing next year. That's a contractual service. We have other things. Both these services are transportation services, our legal costs, our insurance. All of those things combined would increase, again, with some things that we were required to do, some other type of environmental testing. Every so often we're required to do. Those are about $100,000 of an increase that we will be seeing next year. So if you look at the numbers I've shown you, and again, that's without anything in addition, you know, you can just do the math pretty quickly and you'll see that it exceeds the 1.3 million. And this is not unusual. This is part of it. And like I had mentioned, you know, right now our contractual increases, I think Valerie had mentioned, but if you have retirements, and these are things that help offset some of those contractual increases, as well as sometimes, you know, it could be that a particular employee doesn't have to be replaced, whether it be an aide or different things that are based upon student needs. So, you know, there's different ways we approach this, and you know, to try to fit within that budget cap, and then try to make some savings and reductions where we can to close those gaps.
And you can see the challenge associated with trying to, as we talked about earlier, you know, add some to a reserve, like a TRS reserve. You know, when we have, you know, these, which are just the sort of normal cost of operating, you know, a school district, which every school district has. I mean, these are going to be here regardless. And, you know, as you saw earlier, you know, we're only going to get what we're going to receive from the state of New York. So we really are constantly trying to, you know, use our best thinking to kind of solve that problem. And, you know, and with that, we have some unfunded mandates, you know, which are, as I said, in and of themselves, you know, we can't disagree with the state wanting to make sure that, you know, there's a, you know, we have you know, we're looking out for the safety, health, and welfare of all of our children by ensuring that we have cameras. You know, cameras are a big part of, you know, a lot of school districts, because it helps us to see, you know, who's walking around the building, who's entering the building, and where they are when they're in the buildings, and hopefully they're behaving themselves when they're in the building. That's an expense, you know, that is a requirement, and you know, and every district has, you know, a fair number of cameras, you know, that are everywhere, you know, again, to ensure, you know, the safety, health, and welfare of everyone. So some of these mandates, which are historical, I mean, testing and scoring is historical. And the state doesn't say, you know, send them up to us, we'll provide the boxes, and there's no cost to you. You know, none of that happens. They don't, you know, the state doesn't say, you know, you can send them to, you know, the Lower Hudson, you know, Information Center, and they're going to score them for free. So all of these things cost money. Our private school transportation, out-of-district placement youngsters who are our children, but, you know, their education is provided in another district, we have to pay to transport them, as we should. But those are expenses that, you know, are part of, you know, the equation, and sometimes those are places that are not within the radius of this of
and it also includes parents who privately place. So it's our own placements, and it's children. So this is just to kind of, there's probably 50 of these, but these are just some, again, that has more, I would say, have a little bit more significance budgetarily. There's many of them that would be required but may not have the impacts, you know, in terms of our budget. And even testing and scoring, a lot of, and I know it's been delayed, but in terms of if there needs to be computer-based testing, what does that mean for the district? Everyone has to have the same device. You can't just, like, they're not going to allow people to use their own devices. Right. So these are all things that have real dollars attached to them.
They do.
Security and safety beyond the cameras. I mean, yes, we're not necessarily required to have all the security staff we have, but there is a need to have an outside person who provides required mandated training to our staff at both the opening of school. That's a requirement, and it's not as though you know, it requires somebody with a level of expertise to ensure that all of our employees are, in fact, and I think I had something earlier on the slide, and I guess I took it off, mandated training. We're required to do trainings with all of our employees every day. There's a cost in doing that. Some of it's face-to-face, and some of it is in the form of, which is still, we still have to pay for, a software where people have to go through a series of professional development every year, whether they're a substitute or a coach or a full-time staff member. There's a cost in doing that every year. There's a cost in bringing people in from the outside to provide these trainings. And that's just another area which is, you know, something we have to keep in mind when we're developing our budget. And then these other items too, we just talk about some mandates in terms of ENL, ELL, special ed requirements, Triborough. All Triborough is referring to is that even in absence of a newly negotiated contract, the benefits of the contract still go on. So we talked about the step increases. Those happen regardless if we have a settled contract or not, because the state mandates us to allow all the contractual increases that are already in the contracts to continue regardless of a settled agreement. So these are things that, so we have an increase year over year even without a settled contract.
And that's important to us because Triborough also ensures that, let's say, teachers and administrators don't go on strike.
Well, that's important, yeah.
If
That's
that
why
were to
they
happen,
did it.
that's the important part of Triborough, in addition to, again, making sure that, people don't experience hardships as a result of something that, that happens. And the other sort of component under, our mandated services for English as a new language learners or English language learners and for our special education students is, we want to make sure that we, comply with requirements to educate all children well and to ensure the success of all children. We could certainly, ensure that we bring back children who are placed out of district, but bringing children back into the district, which is absolutely our desire, may not be the most affordable way in which we can manage that, because it does mean that we have to provide the services to children. So if there are additional, teacher assistants or teacher aides that are needed for a time to be with that child so that the child is successful, we do absolutely have to make sure that that happens. Or, if there are just other services that need to be provided, such as speech or, occupational therapy or, all of those services do, have to be in place in order for us to meet the requirements under, providing a least restrictive learning environment. And we want to do that because, again, this is in service to ensuring that every child, experiences success and has the supports, to enable them to do that.
And again, I just spoke about earlier, lead environmental testing. These are just items, again, not to say lead testing is not important, but there was an issue a couple years ago now. All districts are required to have this expenditure every so often, and it has to, it's fairly expensive to do it. All these other things, GASB reporting, really just speaks to all these different reports now that are making us more like a business, but there's a cost in doing it. So when the financial reporting standards changed in New York State, some of it required us to do to work with actuaries to help us to put into our financial statements the cost of providing health insurance and all that. But again, you have to pay somebody to do that. So these are things that were new that at times can be anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 additional costs a year. Internal audits, although there's a value to them, we have three auditors that work within the district a year. These were requirements to ensure that things were, that nobody was stealing and things. But now there is a cost in doing it, and it's almost like, I think the value in terms of taxpayers, like the internal audit is about $30,000 in addition to our external audit, which is another $40,000. So again, these are things we're required to do, and there's a cost in doing those things. And again, translation, things that we would do, but now kind of a across the board requirement to translate many of our documents into all different languages, and of course we want to do that, but there is a fairly significant cost in doing that.
Right, we could just ask someone to do those because there are legal expectations as well, and if there are documents such as IEPs, those do have to be sent out to professional service to be translated, and again, we're required to do it and we should do it, but that is an additional cost to the district.
Okay, so this is just, again, to give just some information as we speak about contracts and we speak about our spending in general. And these are just some things, and there's a lot of different rankings I could pull out. And it kind of gives us, though, a sense of like how do we spend our dollars, and how does that put us in comparison to other districts around Westchester and Putnam County. So these are just some I kind of pulled for comparison. And as we speak about our teachers here, so Hastings is ranked 31 out of 52 districts in total teacher salary. And what this speaks to is, obviously one meaning you have the most lucrative contract, and where that puts us in Westchester. So when we speak about contractual raises and step increases, and although sometimes you look at it, well, that's a lot, but where does that put us? And this is really talking about true dollars of what people's compensation level will be over a 25-year career in a district. So it does really take into consideration the total compensation people will receive. And as you can see, as much as it shows that we have, and our bargaining is, to their credit, have worked with the district to not, they're not the most lucrative contract out there. It actually, like I said, puts us 31 out of 52 districts. But in terms of our ranking as a school district in Westchester, we're probably top 10. So I think in thinking about, we have this wonderful teaching staff that have worked, we continue to try to, find efficiencies where we can, but also just to kind of give you a sense of that, you know, our contracts are, I would say, some people would even say, more favorable to management based upon that ranking. Hastings per pupil spending for the 18-19 school year was $29,578. And again, this number really is just a way for people to kind of look at it and compare yourself against each district. It doesn't mean each student here costs us $29,000. What it really does is take your total budget, divides it by your total enrollment. But it's a way to take districts of all different sizes and give them some level of comparison against each other. But certainly, you know, each student isn't costing us that, because some students could cost $200,000 and others, you know, we don't have a seen increase in them coming into the district. That puts us, we're in the median of all of Westchester with that number. So again, I think only 48 people responded to this particular survey, and I think we were right in around the 23rd or 24th range in total in per pupil spending, but it actually puts us the lowest in the river towns, and not by like $1. Like, you know, some of the districts are $4,000 to $5,000 more per student allocation. So again, just try to give you a sense of what is our spending, you know, how does our spending on our budget with taking into consideration our enrollment, how does that compare us to others? And I think, again, this demonstrates that we're not, in terms of spending, we are trying our best to contain spending in terms of, you know, in comparisons. Hastings ranks 21 out of 48. This is just, again, something that people will think, you know, wow, is your central, or maybe central, you know, our administrative spending, how does that put us compared to other districts? Again, we're 21 out of 48 districts in this area in terms of our central office spending. And then in terms of our instructional spending, where are we in this? We're 3rd out of 48. So that really means all of our money is going into the classroom. Yes?
How do you square the circle of the 3rd out of 48 in instructional spending and 31 out of 52 in teacher salary?
Okay, so the salaries that people receive as an individual are less competitive against all these other districts. We have more staff. We actually have more. This really speaks to programs, class size, and all those things, and programming that we offer here, and that we're putting dollars. So although our people are not making as much as their counterparts, you know, we do actually offer more programming and staffing to support the offerings that we have here that are much, you know, much broader than other districts of our size. So I think, but again, it shows you that the dollars we do have available are always driven into the classroom. And not driven into the classroom in form of people's compensation level, but in actual programs. That's what that speaks to. And services for special education and, you know, all of our students. Hastings ranks 4 out of 48 in co-curricular interscholastic spending. I mean, we've spoken about this at other budget meetings. Again, we've spoken about, you know, ways people in this community, they want the breadth of program. We've actually had people who want us to expand those offerings. This shows you, again, it's the student experience. All the dollars are not being, you know, spent on administrative costs, but they're being driven into the programs in the school. And where other schools, again, you know, their way they spend their dollars is a little bit different than this. So again, this is when we speak to community expectations in terms of modified sports, in terms of no cutting policies, in terms of assistant coaches and all the different pieces, this is where these drivers fall in. And we've spoken about this, and when people in the community, when we spoke about that, there's been a pretty, you know, loud kind of outcry about keeping music programs and all the things that we offer and the music lessons and things that we do offer here. And that's why we rank 4th out of 48. Hastings, again, these are things that when we try to take up the budget, we're 42 out of 48 in transportation spending. We are extremely low, and that's even considering we have a good amount of out-of-district spending. Our in-district contract is one of the best in Westchester County. It is one of the lowest in Westchester County, and we have the most efficient ones in like Westchester County in our in-district. So where we can be efficient, we try to be to keep the monies in the classroom.
And it helps that, you know, we only transport K4.
K5, right?
K5, so that
But again,
helps
that's-
us tremendously.
right,
But
right,
still, within,
right.
when we do transport,
Right.
it's you know, really done in ways to be as
Well,
cost
we
effective as
eliminated
possible.
buses a few years ago, and I think that's where, well, and you know, I appreciate people's willingness to do it. People say, oh, they're on the bus an extra 10 minutes, but that saves you a lot of money. I mean, it's a considerable amount And the people who don't have it are schools like Pelham and Pleasantville that are exactly similar size to Hastings, but don't provide it at all. So they're the people who are below us, in that ranking. Hastings ranks 46 out of 52 in debt and capital and building spending. Again, this just is a comparison. This is, we mentioned this before, this is where we rank in terms of investment in facilities. Again, we really do try to drive all the money into the instructional program. That's where the priority of the funding has gone, although of course these other things we do need to spend some money on them. But again, this demonstrates that there's been a lot of thoughtful consideration in terms of how we spend the money there. And again, just to remind, we put our money into the instructional program. So a lot of it is based on some of those earlier things we spoke about, programs, class size, things that are important to people, and where we can tighten and try to make it as efficient as possible, we attempt to do so.
And finally, enrollment trends, as you take a look at, from the 1988 to 89 school year to the projected 2021 school year, there's been significant increases in student enrollment, just over a fairly short period of time. That spike, and it vacillates, which is pretty much the trend in a number of districts, that similar size or even who are a little larger. So these numbers, are pretty steady, and we pay close attention to these. And we, certainly don't want, the disproportionality around, at the elementary level, for example, having larger class sizes where, our objective is to make sure that they're exiting, the elementary with all those foundational skills intact, so that there's no need to, to add more, sort of supplementary services. So it's really important for us philosophically, to keep our eye on these numbers and projected birth rates, and be able to offer all those programs, to offer all those choices, to not have to look at, a class size and say, what, there are X number of children in that class, so we're going to eliminate that so that we can save, and reduce, costs. So that is not, sort of a position that, that has been represented in the budget, but you do see our challenges. You do see our challenges associated with, our expenses, which are, consistent with our, with the region, as well as state aid for regions, for districts like ours, which again, we are not considered a high need district, so we're not going to receive, any increases, that we know of, certainly based upon the number from the governor's state address. And we still have to pay attention to just really making sure that we're mindful in terms of how we judiciously use the resources that are here, and then providing these opportunities to to share these stories about how the budget is developed, as a way of really making sure as we go into the budget season, at our first presentation at February 10th, which really does begin to lay out the realities with tangible numbers associated with some of these these expenses and these priorities that we have for the district. So with that said, we certainly hope that you found these Budget 101 workshops useful and helpful in terms of telling that sort of backstory of budget development. And if you have any questions, we are happy to answer those. I don't know if we have any questions from our virtual community. Janine?
No. Good.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you again for coming. We want to thank Patrick and Janine for making sure that we have a presentation all set up, and that the information from this session was part of a Facebook chat live, and as well as the video, which will be on our website. You see our posters, and thank you, Janine, and all the board and Maureen for collaborating on those, so that those are available. Actually, the poster in the back, and so if you wanted to scan to that, Janine and Patrick, when you get a chance, just to show one of those posters, because it does have a QR code, which also takes anyone who scans that to a location on our website. Thank you, Patrick. To more materials and resources that are available about the capital reserve vote, which we will be talking about more. And certainly we will, we actually have a presentation scheduled at the James Harmon Community Center on January 29th at 6:30. So we hope that you're out and come to that. We'll have our architects and our construction manager there to answer more detailed questions and about the plans, and as well as be able to kind of really understand in conjunction with some of this information why some of the decisions were made. So thank you very much again for coming. Have a good evening.